Good morning. Good morning. Buenos dias and welcome to our today two of Racial Equity Week 2021. Imagine, intersect, and act. I am absolutely excited, overwhelmed, whatever the words are to describe excitement and anticipation for today's conversation, which is going to be led by Roberto Valdez Jr., who is the Associate Director of External Affairs for the Latino Policy Forum. He's going to be talking with next generation Latinx leaders, Latino and Latinas actually, leaders today. And I am so excited to turn this program over to him, and hopefully you'll join us in watching. Welcome, Roberto.
Good morning, Denise. Thank you for having us. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion titled The Next Generation of Latinx Leadership. As Denise mentioned, my name is Roberto Valdez Jr. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the Associate Director of External Affairs for the Latino Policy Forum, and I will be today's moderator for this morning's event. Before we get started, I want to thank Cook County, specifically Denise, for inviting the forum to be part of today's event. Thank you to our panelists that we'll meet in just a sec for taking the time to participate. And of course, I want to thank the audience for joining us this morning. This event coincides with Cook County's third annual Racial Equity Week, with this year's theme focusing on three words: imagine, intersect, act. Today's panel features Latinx leaders in government, community organizing, and policy who will discuss their strengths, their goals, their strategies, and their experiences for bringing more Latinx leadership into civic spaces. Based on the Census 2020 data, Latinos account for 26% of the Cook County population and roughly 18% of the state of Illinois' population, which really makes today's discussion very important as we think about future leadership in Cook County and Illinois, but also how resources and investments into the Latinx community can be equitable and fair. With me today are four inspirational leaders who happen to identify as women. And as someone who has two sisters, grew up with two sisters, I understand firsthand the importance, the significance, and the benefit of what it means to follow fierce, brilliant, and trailblazing women. With all that being said, just want to set context for the rest of today's panel and event. I'll be asking our panelists to introduce themselves briefly in just a sec. Then we'll get started with some questions that we have set up here. And then we'll try our best to leave the last 10 to 15 minutes of the program for some audience Q&A. I do encourage the audience to include questions in the comments box as we're going through our discussion. I will do my best to follow up as necessary and as much as possible. So with that, let's first get started with our introduction. I'll ask Commissioner Anaya to go first, please.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Hi, everyone. This is Alma Anaya. I am the Cook County Commissioner of the 7th District, which represents the southwest side of Chicago, neighborhoods like Little Village, Pilsen, Back of the Yards, McKinley Park, Gage Park, Bidham Park, and many other neighborhoods in the southwest side. I have the most Latino district and the highest concentration of immigrants in the whole county. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Commissioner. Up next, Jessie, if you can introduce yourself.
Good morning. Thank you, Roberto, for having me, and the county for considering me to be on this panel. It's such a pleasure. I'm Jessie Fuentes. I'm the Director of Policy and Youth Advocacy with the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, centered in the heart of the Puerto Rican community, Humboldt Park.
Welcome, Jessie. Up next, Vanessa.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. Vanessa Uribe. I'm the Deputy Director for the Office of Minority Economic Empowerment at the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity.
Thank you, Vanessa. Last but not least, Graciela.
Hi, good morning. My name is Graciela Guzman, she, her, ella. I'm Campaign Director at Healthy Illinois, and we're a campaign that's working to expand healthcare for all people in our state, regardless of their immigration status. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Graciela. Perfect. Well, let's jump right in. The first question really goes out to all four of our panelists. And again, really looking at the future of Latinx leadership, would love to know, and I'll start with you, Commissioner. Can you provide the audience a summary of your journey to where you're at today, whether that's your educational experience, an internship that really stood out, or maybe a job that led you to where you're at today? If you can share that with the audience, that'd be great.
Sure thing. For me, I think most of my life experience has really led me to where I'm at right now. I was born in Guadalajara, Mexico, came to this country with my family at the age of 6, and we were undocumented for most of my life, I would say. It was extremely interesting, but it really molded me into the person that I am and really created a passion of service on my end. So I began to, volunteer here and there with organizations, for example, like Mujeres Latinas en Acción. I decided to do an internship with he's now Congressman Jesus Chuy Garcia. But 10 years ago, almost to the date, I actually started working at the county. So I've been working here diligently to ensure that services become accessible to Latino communities, to the district, and really wanted to continue to pursue that. I really found this intersection in between policy and also direct services. And I really fell in love with that, especially with my experience of being undocumented and seeing my family go through so much growing up. My mom's a survivor of domestic violence, and I often reflect to that, her experience, because I know how difficult it was for her to get services, for her to get any type of guidance, especially being a single parent of 4 here in the city of Chicago, where she did not have any other services or any other family support at the time, because all her family lived in California. So it was extremely important for me to really take that, really use that to be able to empower others. And again, that's how I started working. And in 2018, decided to run for this position, becoming the youngest woman ever elected. One of the very few formerly undocumented people to hold office in the whole country. And I'm currently the only Latina on the Cook County Board of Commissioners. So I carry with me those experience and the passion of serving my people and ensuring that people, again, have access to the services that county provides.
Thank you, Commissioner. Jessie, Graciela, you're both powerhouses in the community. Would love to hear your journey. Jessie, if you can go first, and then Graciela follow, please.
Absolutely. I have the privilege of being born and raised in the community that I served, right? I am, almost the story of the people and the families that I serve in the community. I was born in a single parent household. My mom worked 2 to 3 jobs just to ensure that there could be a plate of food. Both my parents struggled with addiction. And for most of my life, right, we struggled with what it meant to survive in poverty. And I was extremely privileged to be able to have an education that spoke to the lived experience and that provided me the political context for me to understand that. So I go to a high school, a very small alternative high school in Humboldt Park called Dr. Pedro Albizu Campos Puerto Rican High School. And it is at that place that my political consciousness is built, right? I understand colonialism and the colonial experience of Puerto Rican people, specifically here in the diaspora, through curriculum at Albizu Campos, right? And it was being able to understand the colonial experiences of Puerto Rican individuals that for the first time in my life at the age of 16, I'm able to understand my mother, right? I'm able to understand drug addictions. I'm able to understand what it means to have to be away from your family, to work 2 to 3 jobs just to ensure that you can provide a different experience for the next generation. Often, we have young people who are raised in these communities and do not have the privilege of having their political consciousness awakened in that way to become self-actualized and in turn agents of change in our own community, right? And so it's really my high school experience that really turned me into the activist that I am today. And then I go on to Northeastern Illinois, where I do my bachelor's and my master's degree, and being able to take all that I know politically and turn that into action, right? And that's when I learned a difference can be made. I learned, we could do something with these tools, right? I mean, we founded the first Latino Cultural Center at Northeastern. We turned the Latino Latin American Studies minor to a major, and we demanded for money and resources. And, Northeastern Illinois is a Hispanic serving institution that we ensured would live up to its mission. For the first time, I seen myself as something more than just a young Boricua from Humboldt Park, right? I realized if we're going to talk about equity, if we're going to talk about policy, that needs to be accompanied with a political consciousness, right? And there are often a lot of people in spaces that do not have that political consciousness to move policy and resources to places that we know need to have them, right? And that's why I feel so privileged to be here with people like Commissioner Alma, Anaya, with Vanessa, and with Graciela, because these are all powerhouse women that have a political consciousness. And that's important in the realm of policy, but even more important when we're talking about equity in the context of a Latinx community.
Thank you, Jessie. Graciela?
Sure. So I tell people my story honestly starts well before I was even born. My family immigrated from El Salvador to escape the Salvadoran Civil War. And I talk about that because if it were up to them, we wouldn't be in the United States. But unfortunately, there were a lot of situations and a lot of US intervention that led to that situation. So from a really early age, we grew up with that context, right? My parents arrived, they were working 2 or 3 jobs. There were 5 of us as kids. And a lot of our survival was community-based. It was mutual aid. It was my parents realizing that we were better if we were able to leverage one another. So from a really early age, me and my sisters, they would send us off to translate for neighbors. They would put us up on the porch and be like, open mail for your neighbor because they need you, right? So I didn't really grow up with a sense that these skills that I had were special because we were put to the test every single day to make sure that we all had. And it wasn't until I went off to college that I started learning this vocabulary around experiences, right? My family had grown up mixed status because of my parents and how they immigrated. They grew up undocumented pretty much all the way through when I finally got to go to college. My sisters and I were born here in the States as US citizens. And so we got to see that really, really sharp division of who got and who didn't. And so I'd grown up knowing that because I was born in California as a young baby that was born premature, I got to live and get free healthcare in a way that my grandfather, as an undocumented person who had paid taxes, was rejected from a healthcare system and got to die a very undignified death. Go off to college, I'm learning vocabulary for the first time that I think, to Jessie's point, politicized a lot of my lived experience. I'm learning what disparities are, and I'm thinking about who in my community is living and not getting to live. But that in a way kind of incensed me, right? I'm like, okay, there's a vocabulary to finally define these things that I've lived, but what do I do with them? And so I finally got to start my professional career here in Chicago, working when the Affordable Care Act got started. And I'm glad that that happened because I think, again, that anger, that incensed kind of feeling at what a disparity is, I'm looking it in the face. It's not textbook. I'm seeing who's getting to sign up, who's not getting to enroll based on their immigration status. I'm getting to see who's living, who has life expectancy rates that look strong. And newsflash, they weren't any of the communities that I was working here in Chicago. And so that really led to this pipeline of me working to figure out how we could work with so many community folks to expand healthcare for all people. But I think most grounded by my community history, because it taught me, the power of being that voice that says no. And I say that because I think Jessie talked about the arm of policy being such a powerful tool. It's a powerful tool when it meets the community push and the community voicing. But if we let it sit from the iron chair that says, this is how policy has always worked, this is how the rules are written, it always stays that way. And it always disenfranchises those that it's meant to disenfranchise. It'll stay unopened and unavailable for those that we don't seek to open it for. And I think that's what I pride myself most in my career, that my community taught me to be really good at never accepting a no, that there's always a way. If we don't get in through the front door, we're going to get through the side, we're going to get in through the window, we're going to take the roof off, we're going to dig a tunnel underneath. It doesn't really matter how you tell me that we're not going to get it, because we're going to get it. Because I think that's the other thing that my community taught me is the resourcefulness of all of the tools of our experience. That sometimes that looks like policy, sometimes that looks like organizing, organizing. Sometimes that looks like direct service, but that when we bring all of those tools and the richness of the community experience to bear, we end up successful for everyone. So I'm most grounded again by my family, my immigrant experiences, but I think honestly just the stubbornness, how freaking terca I was taught to be. And I'm thankful for that, because I think it's always met opportunities for folks to not give me what my community needs, with the opportunity for me to really like shine by just being as stubborn as hell to make sure that we do.
Thank you for sharing, Graciela. And Vanessa, if you will, kind of wrap up this introduction, tell us about your journey, but then pivoting to one word of advice you would give your younger self about the path that you took to where you're at today. So if you can kind of combine those two things.
Sure, I can try, especially following, my fellow panelists are just amazing, and I'm so inspired by each of them. But similar, I guess, I grew up in La Vita, so on the south side of Chicago. First in my family to go to college. It's a primarily Mexican immigrant community. It's beautiful, very homogenous. And I do think that, I kind of expanded my scope a bit when I got to high school. I ended up going to a high school in the West Loop. It had students from all over the city. I was able to meet folks who spoke different languages, who, ate different food, who had, were coming from different parts of the city that I didn't even know existed, because growing up in La Villita, you're lucky if you make it downtown. I was just kind of opened up. And then I think, that's the first time I had significant experience with folks that were different than me, but it was in college when I learned about like our true American history, right? I think in public schools, I went to CPS, we're taught the cookie cutter version of history. African-American history is whitewashed and diluted. And when I got to college, I ended up taking an African-American history course that just kind of opened up my eyes a bit. I took another, and I ended up majoring in, African-American history along with political science. The master plan was to go to law school and do civil rights law, because I always did have like something, right, that connected me back to the community and wanting to do more, knowing the struggles that me and my family went through and that all of my neighbors and extended family did. But having that experience where we realize that systemic racism is real, and that it's intentional and it's longstanding, and it's something that, really is touching every fabric of society, to a certain extent, it's like infuriating, right? And you're like, I need to do something, to break down some of these barriers, because they're holding me back. They're making my start line, way back there when everybody else gets to start, way ahead of me. That's not fair, and it's not just me, right? I think we could say that this is systemic and it's widespread, and it's affecting communities of color in particular. Black and brown folks are disproportionately impacted by a number of different systems that are part of our society. Government is one of those number one factors that have done this, and I'll speak a little bit about that in my role now. But coming out of college, I was really inspired and I wanted to do something. The master plan was law school. I pivoted a bit and I joined the National Council of La Raza, which is now Unidos US. I was there for many years, and that really taught me a lot about like coalition building, policy development, advocacy work, community organizing, building up the capacity of nonprofit and community organizations that are based at the grassroots level, that can really impact, not only be the voice and ears of the community, but then can impact, policy development and things that we're seeing at a higher level. And so that really opened up my eyes. I was able to travel to different parts of the country, and I saw other Mexican, communities. I saw other Puerto Rican communities. I saw other, more diverse communities, and I saw they might be a little different demographically. They might be made up a little bit different in leadership or in structure, but systemically, we're dealing with the same issues. And oftentimes, when I was at the table, the lucky times that I got to be at the table, and I was able to see who else was making these decisions, who was the one that was really trickling down the policy and the programs that impacted our communities. It wasn't folks like us, right? It wasn't people who understood what it was like to grow up in a single family household, what it was like to translate documents for my entire family, what it was like to have the pressure of going to college for the first time, because you needed to be the one to make it because no one else in the family did, right? Like no one else understood that. And so being at that table was not just important, but then having a voice at that table was even more so. And then that's where it really started to change for me, because I decided to go back to school. I got my master's in public administration. I was like, I want to go back to Chicago. I want to be involved locally. That's actually when I joined Cook County's Bureau of Economic Development. And I started doing economic development work. Being the only Latina in economic development, I can tell you we're unicorns. And, you know, it's a white male dominated space, and economic development is intertwined with so many other systems, right? When we talk about intersectionalism, economic development is fundamental there. And there wasn't a lot of people of color. And so then that was just striking to me. You know, through that experience, you know, I really just, I think, got empowered a bit. Being the only person oftentimes in these spaces was like, hey, this is not okay. I need to say something about it, because if I don't, no one else will. You know, I got to work with Commissioner Anaya and a number of other folks at the county on the 2020 census program, which, if anybody was involved in the census program, it was a once in a lifetime experience. You know, great and challenging. And I think all of those things together kind of led me to where I am today, which is in the Office of Minority Economic Empowerment at the Department of Commerce. Again, another economic development space that doesn't have a lot of folks like us in these rooms. And, you know, to be focused on minority economic empowerment, I have some issues with the terms. But long story short, we're really building up communities, right? Because when we talk about business owners, when we talk about folks that are leading, you know, our local economies, when we think of places like Humboldt Park and, you know, Paseo Boricua or 26th Street in Little Village, these are engines, right, that not just drive our economy, but that drive our families, our educational systems, our, you know, criminal justice systems, which is another, you know, story that we could dive into. All of that to say, right, that it's so important that we have folks in all of these different spaces, and that they're empowered to say something when we need to say something, and that we can identify and break down barriers that are intentional and systemic, that are holding our communities back from reaching their full potential. And I guess, you know, transitioning to the piece of advice, right, or a word, I think purpose, right? I didn't always know that I had this purpose. I didn't know that the spaces that I was in were making a difference somehow. I was contributing somehow to this bigger picture. And as I volunteered, as I've gotten to work with more folks, I mean, recently I got introduced to Jessie, and we're going to be working together more closely, so I'm excited about that. But as you learn more and more, the folks that are involved, the amazing people who are leading this work, you realize that everyone contributes and everyone has a role to play and a purpose in this work. And it really is important to just have that centered so that we don't lose sight of it, because it's easy to be in these in these systems. It's easy to be in these spaces and kind of stick to the status quo. And it's important for us to always remember that our purpose is really to challenge the system and to change and break down barriers so that we can create long-term changes and progress in our communities.
Thank you, Vanessa. I was just jotting down words that were coming to mind while you all spoke: passion, fire, motivated, foresight. Right, you guys, you ladies were in experiences, but you know, you had this foresight of kind of what you wanted to do with the situation that you were in. And I'll ask Commissioner Anaya. You know, understanding that the Latino community is growing in Illinois, county, city of Chicago, and nationally, what does that mean for your work? And even as future Latinx leaders looking into spaces like this, what does that mean really in the grand scheme of things?
Boy, it means a lot. I think for far too long, you know, I mentioned earlier in my introduction that I'm the only Latina on the Cook County board. And a lot of people, when I tell them that, they're still a little shocked, right? I think because the county is so diverse, you know, you highlighted some of the numbers in representation in Latinos. And I think for far too long, the Latino community has not seen equity and has not seen parity. And I think it's definitely, and whether it's in these positions that we've talked about, in the positions that we currently are, or in these spaces where we do have to, you know, raise our voice, or we do have to remind people that the Latino community needs help, that they need attention. I think it's quite frustrating, but it's also, you know, to Vanessa's point, intertwined within policies. And it's definitely something that we need to figure out how to continue to push. And again, it just seems, you know, we're so off the mark in some aspects, because the census and, you know, how challenging it was even for my district to get counted. It was still, no matter how many events we did, how many, you know, distributions, how many, times BD went out and we had, census folks, it was still a challenge because of the previous federal administration and the fear that was engraved into immigrant communities and how that really impacted, my district was still has the lowest response rate in the 2020 census. And I think even though there were areas where there was lowest self response, we still saw growth in the Latino community, and we still saw how diverse the Latino community is, right? We're not all Mexicans, and I think that that's frustrating in itself. But we need to make sure that we continue to push for the Latino community, the growth, and also how spread out we are, right? And I think that that's something that is not really taken into account. Oftentimes you think of, just two areas, right, in Cook County, let's say Humboldt Park and La Villita. And the reality is that the Latino community has spread out, and we've seen it again in the census numbers, into suburban areas where there is no infrastructure for Latino and immigrant communities. And I think, the work that has been done, especially, that we have Graciela here, the work that has been done to protect undocumented individuals is extremely important. And that's why we need people in the spaces to raise their voice, and we need that parity and that equity. So I think if at all, I think we need to make sure that that we need to push on that end and continue to push, because the growth of the Latino population is something that can't really be stopped at this point. And the policy and everything that we're pushing for, whether it's language access or whether it's just representation, it definitely needs to be highlighted. And we have seen it a lot. The last thing that I'll say on that is data is important, right? We all know that data is important, and we know that the census data was important. But a lesson learned that really opened my eyes extremely during the 2020, pandemic leading into 2021 was how invisible the Latino community was at the beginning, because they did not want to count the Latino community as Latinos, right? As they were counted as white. Therefore, it created this really huge gap in really being able to do outreach and let our Latino communities know, hey, this is a real thing and it's impacting us. We can't solve it with Sprite, right? We can't solve it con, all the remedios that we have. But it was really eye-opening in many sense, because I think that that's something we need to continue to push, is to be recognized as a population and not be really kind of shoved into different numbers, because that really impacted our community. We saw the different areas, the zip codes that were impacted, out of the top 5 of the zip codes, I had 3 in my district that were impacted by the pandemic, yet the resources were not getting out there, the information was not getting out there. And the reason why I say that that's a lesson learned is because we need to make sure that we push for the recognition of the Latino community, and we definitely push for the policy change and everything that comes after. But it's extremely important that we start even with the basics of the data. We start off with ensuring that nobody and our communities are not invisible, that they are very present, and that we demand the different changes and accommodations to our community so that we're not impacted negatively the next time. And I think that that's very, very prevalent during the pandemic, but it needs to be more prevalent during the recovery. And I think that at every level of government, we need to make sure that we do that, and in all of our work on a day-to-day. So I would say I'll stop there, because I know my wonderful co-panelists have a lot of wonderful things to add on to that. So thank you, Roberto.
Thank you, Commissioner. No, the forum agrees, data is really the driver of the conversation, the narrative. So Graciela, I'll ask you the similar question. How has the growth of the Latino community impacted the work that you've done? I mean, Healthy Illinois has done some amazing work the past few years. So curious how the growth has helped you and the work that you've done.
Sure. So to the commissioner's point about data, when we look at one of the largest segments in our state that does not have coverage, has no pathway to coverage for a variety of reasons, we have to put Latinos and specifically undocumented and immigrant Latinos in that category. And so for 7 years, the campaign had really been positing this argument, right? How do we explore policy options? How do we carve things out? And then the pandemic just put all of our plans kind of into hyperdrive, right? Because again, we were seeing rates that looked astronomical in comparison to other populations without the resources to really meaningfully be able to put healthcare first for those families. They were hearing left and right, story after story of families that told us, I had 105 fever for 3 days and my immigration status made me more fearful of medical debt and medical bills than my own death, right? And I think for us, that really told us whatever plans we have to be unapologetic about pursuing policy change during this pandemic that transforms not only how our community at large can access healthcare, but what pathways are we pushing and advancing in conversation. So in partnership with Commissioner and so many other folks that are in the community, our coalition was able to fight for coverage for undocumented and immigrant seniors 65 and over. Which is a huge win. There's about 6,500 seniors that were able to get coverage for the first time as a part of that expansion. And we were able to come back this session and continue expanding and building upon that. So as of next year, Illinois will also offer coverage to folks 55 and over. And I think the power of the data shows, right? We have a really strong, vibrant Latinx community, but a lot of what we were hearing was the benefit of expansion intergenerationally. That if we are able to really meaningfully invest in our essential workers and our community members that really need this strong coverage, that they're going to get to continue to do the things that our communities need them to do. They're going to be able to continue in civic leadership. They're going to be able to build strong families, be strong community members, do the work that makes Illinois great. But we're also hearing from younger communities that were saying, hey, like our families are actually going to get to be in the state much longer than we would have thought. And if we want to think about their retirement, if we want to think about what our lives look like as young people in the 30s and 40s that are going to have to think about our families and what their healthcare looks like, expansion makes sense for us because not only is it taking care of our parents and our grandparents, but it's also securing our economic opportunity and viability as young people that are trying to figure out how do we make this work. So I think, again, that the data really told us that the Latinx community is going to continue to grow. It's the time for something well beyond the Band-Aid that, yes, we can talk about financial assistance, we can talk about charity care, but that unless we're structurally changing the system to be an open door for every single person, regardless of barrier, we're not doing enough. And I'm really, really proud of that work to just generally transform the healthcare system for all people in our state. I tell that to people now because they say, okay, Graciela, like y'all are good. You passed 55 and over, you're done. We're like, no, we still got 1964. Like we're gonna keep going because again, I think the immediacy of the gains tells us that we have to be aggressive about pursuing that timetable and not stopping until we have everyone covered because the Latinx community is going to continue growing. And the sooner that we can make sure that everyone has healthcare in their hands, the sooner that we can actually start talking about what healthcare opportunity looks like for folks. Right? Do we have a strong healthcare system that means that life expectancy isn't so wide from community area to community area, that instead of talking about death in the Latinx community, we're getting to talk about vibrancy because we're getting to treat people the ways that they deserve with dignity and care in their system, regardless of insurance status. So I think I'm really, really excited by the fact that we're getting to make pivots in that conversation that meaningfully move us away, again, from the deaths of our people, more so to what does it take to really sustain and be able to grow vibrancy of the Latinx community because we're addressing a basic need, which is access to healthcare.
Thank you, Graciela. Vanessa, next question goes to you, and then Jessie, if you can follow after. What can government and civic spaces do better or more of to encourage more Latinx leaders to pursue a career in those fields?
I think that's a big question, right? I think there's a lot that they could be doing. I think there's some fundamentals, right? One of the things that I learned through my racial equity fellowship was the racial impact equity assessment, which is really just taking a deeper dive at the programs that we develop, who they burden, who they benefit. And I think also applying that same equity lens to things like job descriptions. And, we often have like requirements when you're applying for a position, especially in government, government. There's a citizenship question oftentimes. There's a question around, your educational attainment, and they're not always connected to the position or the role that you'll be doing. And so that's, I think, a very fundamental space that we could start reviewing and thinking about to just be more inclusive of all of our community members, and start to kind of break down some of those barriers. I think beyond that, it really is about being more inclusive. I think, there's, especially in Chicago, when we talk about the Chicago area, we think about the Chicago way in government and in politics. And unfortunately, there's a lot of old school like patronage and nepotism and things that at least people connect, right, to the way that government function in this area. I don't necessarily think that that's true. And I think we have, an amazing elected representative with us today who is, I think an example of that not being true. And we're making a lot of progress. But I do think that that there's ways that we could start to kind of change that dynamic a bit. And that's really by, broadening the ways that folks can enter these spaces, making them more inclusive, making sure that internally, right, once we get into these spaces, that we're changing the rules and the processes so that they are actually more reflective of the communities that we're serving. I'd love to see, a breakdown of just government employees. And I think we see this in everything, but like leadership roles, departments that are kind of creating community-facing programs. Like, where is the representation there? Where do we ensure that we have enough folks from the community in these spaces? And how can we ensure that we're creating those pathways? So I think it's really just taking a deeper dive into just some of the fundamentals, while also being very intentional about making sure that we have representation in these spaces of experiences, of diversity of thought, and of our communities. Because as Commissioner Anaya said, I'm half Chapina, I'm half Guatemalan, and in Little Village that was like a big deal, and it's not, right? It's like the country right next to Mexico, and it's very similar. But I think it speaks to us kind of sometimes being pigeonholed into the Mexican community, where we're very diverse and the area is very diverse. And so how are we ensuring that we have that representation as well?
And Jessie, same question, but I would also add, what can non-for-profits do to really encourage leadership in those spaces as well?
Absolutely. So I echo all of Vanessa's sentiments. What I would add is opening spaces for real perception, right? Often, I spent 9 years as a school administrator, right? And last year I made the wildest choice to dive into the world of policy, right? And I still get asked the question all the time, like, why, right? Why did you choose? Often the perception is this is a dead end road, like a dead end career, like it's a dog and pony show, right? And that's often what people in our community perceive policy to be. We have to be able to open doors for real change. And that's not just in government, that's also at nonprofit places, right? Giving Latinx folks positions that are not just symbolic. And we see it often, right? We get titles, we get positions that don't allow us to truly enact change, right? It's our position in the very title and seat we hold is symbolism. And we have to be able to change the dynamic in nonprofit agencies and in government, allowing someone like me who's I'm also half Puerto Rican and half Cuban, right? And people don't ever acknowledge the other half of me, right? And those are two very politically different experiences that I hold as an individual, but we can't deny that I'm also a masculine presenting lesbian, right? My lived experience is very different than my fellow panelists here. And I should be able to bring that very lived experience to changing policy, right? It's not just about what's on my resume or the professional and educational experience that I'm able to put to paper, but my entire lived experience should inform my work. And often we assume spaces that don't allow that will not affirm my very identity and how that should impact policy or impact community change or impact governmental decisions. And so we have to have real conversations about the positions that we open, right? Because there's a difference between opening doors and getting Latinos into seats and achieving real equity, right? We have not done that yet. And the fight for equity, and we had this question earlier, what's one piece of advice you would give yourself, your younger self? And mine would be is that this is a struggle in perpetuity. We're not done yet, right? We do a comparative analysis often, and we say we've gotten so far. There's so much that has been done. Great. We're not there yet, right? And until we can start achieving things that actually make change and opening doors and opening seats in which we can actually impact policy and not continue to hold policy that continues to sustain white supremacy, we have not achieved equity just yet. Until I can walk through a door and fully do the job of my full lived experience, we haven't achieved equity yet. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And it's not just in government spaces, Roberto. I would agree. Some of our nonprofit friends have a lot of work to do, right? Because we're Latino serving nonprofit agencies with a white board and a white leader. And so we have to do more work, right? And we have to be open to the idea that there are Latinx leaders in our community who have the capacity and ability to do so.
I just want to let you know, I have a colleague in my office right now listening to all this, and she's like, preaching over here, and so just right spot on. I just want to remind the audience before I go into my next question that if you have any questions for the panelists, we're going to use the last 10-15 minutes to ask those. Please put those questions in the comment box. So would really appreciate that. So I think this will be hopefully the final question until we pivot to audience questions. And this goes for everyone. How would you invite someone listening to get involved in government, activism, and community work? Maybe provide resources, recommendations, anything that could point them, if you will, to the right direction. And I'll ask Vanessa, if you can go first, please.
So this one stumped me a little, but I think, because I think we've talked about just how unique it is and how there's so many different spaces and there's so many opportunities there. And it really is, I think, unique to the individual. But one thing that I wish I would have known is just to reach out, right? I think I would make myself available, and I would assume perhaps my fellow panelists would as well. But reach out to folks in these spaces, because I think that it really goes a long way to make connections. It seems like sometimes I felt, and I mentioned this at the beginning, that I was often alone. And then, and then I started meeting folks like my fellow panelists and others. And I think that, to the extent that we're making progress, there's more of us out there. But I think if you're interested in these spaces, if you have some questions, start by reaching out to folks that are already there. I think it really goes a long way to just provide a little bit more insight into, what you're thinking and what your unique interest and contributions can be to all of these different spaces. I often think I wouldn't be kind of where I am now if I hadn't tried certain things. And so that really goes a long way, like having, diverse experiences, internships, things of that sort go a long way. I think when we talk about internships, and then I think this goes for everyone, but making sure that they're paid internships, because there's not, we often don't have that same type of luxury where we could just take an internship and have bills and everything else paid for. So I would say, start reaching out, looking at paid internships, reaching out to folks in these spaces to just learn a little bit more about them, but really honing in on what your unique interests are and what your skills and contributions can be. And I think that, that's always a good start, but there's lots of opportunities and lots of spaces there.
And whoever wants to go next, jump on in.
Well, I would just say that, this work is hard, and I will never deny that to anyone that asks, right? This, again, it is a struggle in perpetuity. We're trying to achieve something that we may not see in our lifetime. But I wake up every day with purpose, right? And one of my fellow panelists said that in a discussion. This work is meaningful. And it is beyond ourselves. I don't come into my office. I don't go into community. I don't go and testify at a hearing because it's about me, right? I go because it is about a community that needs us. And to know that we are fighting for something greater than ourselves, right? Something that my mother wished she could have had, or that I hope one day my children can have, is what wakes me up every day. We've all had a job or we've all done something, right? That just for whatever reason didn't fill the gap. It didn't fill the hole, right? but I am completely fulfilled as much as sometimes I am frustrated. and that is the beauty of our work is that there's so much gray area. It is so complex. But it is in the complexity in which you find beauty, where you can build beautiful relationships with people who are fighting for something similar, who have the same fight for justice in their heart, to be able to build relationships and live a life of learning, right? And I'm a nerd in that way, right? Like, I love that I wake up every day and I know I'm gonna learn something different, whether that is from someone in the community that's teaching me about something that I don't know, or whether that is when I'm along my elected official friends or other grassroots organizers. I'm a better person each day because of who I encounter in the work.
I would echo Jessie and Vanessa. I think what my experiences have taught me is the importance of those relationships. I think one, acknowledging that I'm here because of a lineage of really strong healthcare, justice, women in all kinds of identities that have created spaces for folks like me to be able to do what I do best. You know, they took the time to teach me what policy looked like. They took time to teach me the ways that I shouldn't be complacent in that, how to really make sure that I felt strong in every room that I walked into, even when I didn't actually feel strong and I had to fake it till I could make it. So those relationships are really important, not just from the sake of learning, but also I think Jessie's point, acknowledging this work is hard. You need a community around you that can reflect you to you at the times that you can't see yourself, but that you need to remain grounded in your why. I also say that because I think when I think about long-term movement building, and the same time that we're learning and building community amongst each other, we need to be as intentional in building that pipeline as we can, because if we ourselves are not pouring into folks as we are kind of like growing in this work, what will that pipeline look like in 30 and 40 years? And that's what I think about every single room that I enter in. Like, what have I done that will make it easier for someone like me to be able to do this work if I were to step away from it for whatever reason? And I think just, again, acknowledging that each one of us has a gift. Sometimes it takes time to be able to crystallize, this is my voicing. Maybe it's me building relationships with people and being the convener. Maybe it's me being able to articulate my community perspective in X fashion. Maybe I'm the person, the statistician that knows the data and knows what data point and what argument I need to connect it to. But really finding out what your gift is that you bring into that room and being unapologetic, or building that rapport with people around you so that you feel unapologetic and that you can say and do the things that you have to do is really critical. And I wish I would have done that more in my 20s and spent less time being fearful about who I was and how it was going to present, and just doing the damn thing, because once I started doing the thing, it got a lot better for me and my community.
And Commissioner?
Yeah, so Graciela brought up a word that I just keep thinking about this whole time that we've been talking, this whole panel, and is intentional, right? Intentionality. Whether in government, you know, or other spaces, need to be intentional about including Latinos and creating space, changing policy, but just as much our community needs to be intentional as well, because it's so much easier to just kind of like turn the blind eye and just kind of go through the motions. But we know that something inside of us, when there's an inequity or an injustice, we know something doesn't feel right. There is something in us, in our community, that lets us know that something is not right, that there is an injustice, that there is something wrong. So I think, you know, if somebody wants to get involved, you need to tap into that. You need to tap into your passion, into your lived experiences, some of the areas that you know, that you think that are not right, and really get involved, no matter how small, because all of these spaces, all of these rooms, all of these tables are important. My first elected position was a community member of a local school council, because I knew I needed to be there. I knew that I needed to, although I don't have kids, I don't have children, I knew that as a community member, I needed to be in that space, and that I needed to show what the rest of the community, whether it was the immigrant community, the Latino community, but what that community needed. So I think for somebody that wants to get involved, they need to know that. They need to know that they need to tap into themselves, really push yourself, and really make it uncomfortable, because I guarantee that every person on this panel has had to push that feeling of feeling uncomfortable in a lot of these spaces, to speak up or to talk or just to get involved. Because again, it's so much more, it's so easy, it's just easier to just kind of turn the blind eye, just go through it, just go through the motions. But I think it speaks volumes to, the resiliency of the Latino community, that we've gone through it with so many barriers against us, right? And I think that we owe it to our ancestors, we owe it to our future generations to be that voice and to continue to move it along, and make sure to push for progress and really stand up for that. So getting involved is whether it's in a small area or another. I know that I believe Jessie might have mentioned it, or Vanessa, just, reach out to the people that are already there. There's very few of us in a lot of these positions, but, I have yet to find somebody that asks me for help or wants to meet with me that I've said no to. I try because I know how difficult it is to get here. I know how difficult it is to be in these spaces alone, and we need more people. We need to continue to push with a united front. So, I mean, those would be, some of the advice that I think I would push and encourage others, of course, to do. I mean, I think jumping in is the best way, and being intentional about it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Belém had a question that actually, and I can read Belém's question in a sec, but I'm curious, we're talking about folks who are looking to go into these spaces. What if you're already in these spaces? What would you say to those who could potentially be mentors? What steps should they take, or what opportunities are out there that they can leverage to help, attract or recruit others, if you will? Anyone can answer that question, please.
I can start, really. I think Jessie said it best. Sometimes we're in these spaces and it's not about us, it's about what we're doing for the community. And I think if for people who are already in the spaces and have been able to accomplish so much, sometimes it gets tiresome in the sense where we have so many responsibilities, so much stress, and our mental health sometimes suffers, that it's really hard for us to comprehend being able to reach and help others and really pull people into these spaces. But we need to just stop thinking about that. Obviously, attending to our needs as an individual, but understanding that it's so much greater than just us as an individual. It is definitely about our communities. And I think that it's extremely important for us to reach out, to be mentors, to really be trailblazers, but also just opening the doors for others, because I didn't run for this position to be the only Latina. That's not, the goal. The goal is to ensure that there's representations, that there's people at the table, again, that are speaking truth to power about our people, but also ensuring that the policies are reflective and are not damaging, as they have been historically and for centuries upon centuries, to people of color. So I think it's extremely important for people in those spaces to really not second guess themselves about mentoring people, because sometimes we do feel like, oh man, I don't think that I'm the best mentor. It's like, no, you've gone to where you've gone because of your merit, because of your passion, because of your experience. It's not because, you were just put in a position. And I think that we need to just kind of get out of that complex and understand that we do have to reach out and continue to mentor other young people and get them involved, but really know our worth ourselves.
Yeah. And I echo everything Commissioner Anaya has voiced. The only thing that I would add is our own perception of what mentoring is, right? Often we think about mentoring folks who want to do grassroots organizing, or folks who want to get into electoral politics, or folks who want to do policy. We think about it as this like daunting task, right? We got to show them everything, and it's our responsibility on how they come out, right? Look, my greatest mentors just had meaningful relationships with me. They listened to me. They answered questions when I had them. They also let me make mistakes, right? Like, I can't tell you how many times I screwed up a press conference, or how many times I took on a grassroots organizing project and, we had no one show up. But my mentors didn't stress themselves out about ensuring that I got it perfect. They allowed me to learn from my own organizing, right? And then when I needed a helping hand, they were there. So it's really about like our own perception of mentoring. Often we choose not to assist young people who want to get involved because we're scared of what that would look like for us, right? But I pride myself in building really meaningful relationships with people and hoping that relationship alone inspires them to continue to do the work.
And I'll really quickly build on what Jessie said, because I do think that reframing what mentorship looks like is really significant. When I think about specifically the voice of young people and what they've done in the healthcare justice movement, they've been really, really strong disruptors. They keep us on our toes to shift the status quo and why that is. And I think we owe it to our community to really continue cultivating those voices and helping them find whatever pathway it is that they want in the movement, and not imposing what we think they should do or what that should look like. When I think about my 20s, so much of that was pathways that did not exist, jobs that did not exist until I created them, or until I created my own job description, right? So I think I tell young people all the time, you're probably charting out something that does not exist yet until you put it to paper. And I think Jessie's point about how do we create a compassionate, open, vulnerable environment for curiosity and for learning that is apologetic about and graceful about things that don't go well, successful, and honoring like when we do things really, really well, but also connecting history to present, right? What are things that did not go well in previous movements that you can avoid? What are things that you should really center, which is always people and relationships, and you've heard that all the way here, right? And where can this go, right? And I think that's what when I think about mentorship, it's really bi-directional, making sure that we center what people want to learn, making sure that we're connecting them to leaders into strong paths, and giving them the context to build a future that we can't imagine in our present.
Vanessa, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I think, yes, all of that for each of my panelists. I think the only other thing is like when I think of being in these spaces and my own experience, and I think what was the most helpful and what I hope to be able to help others is just offering access to the experience. I think, if you're in a space and you're observing, that is so big, and it might not seem, I think Commissioner Anaya was speaking about, perhaps the perceived burden of the mentor, like, oh, I have to do this, or maybe I'm not prepared to do that. But just inviting folks into the room, even if they're just observing, having them shadow you, having them see the way that these spaces function can go such a long way. And I know that it did for me, and I hope that it will do it for others. And I know that's something I'm committed to doing. But just making sure that we're providing we're opening that door so that other people can get insight and get experience into these spaces, so that they hopefully, to Graciela's point, right, can change them and can, create something completely different. But they can't do that if they really have nothing to work with, if they don't know, the way that it already functions. So just offering up opportunities to get people into these experiences and into these spaces.
Great. So final question, when we have a couple of minutes. I think a critical piece is supporting each other, community-wise and career-wise, et cetera. So tell us about something you are working on now and how we can support. And I'll go with Jessie first, if you will.
Yeah, well, Vanessa alluded to it earlier. We were able to pass a bill with the support of Senator Cristina Pastrana-Zayas, Leader Delia Ramirez, and Senator Omar Aquino, the Cultural Designated District Bill, which is going to give real opportunity to community sustainability. And it's a statewide bill. And we're really looking forward. Actually, the governor is due to sign it this week. Yes. And we're looking forward to working with Vanessa and her team and really talking about the intersectionality of economic development, right? COVID hit the Puerto Rican community hard. We had business owners lose their businesses. We had families lose jobs. We have parents worried about what does the next 3 to 5 years look like for me in this community, a community that's rapidly being gentrified. So we're working on community sustainability, ensuring that we can bring affordable housing to our community, and that the place that Puerto Ricans and Latinos and African-American families have called home for so long do not have to face displacement. And we could hope that we do that through the bill in partnership with DCEO.
Commissioner Vanessa, Graciela, anything you'd like to plug in?
I would just quickly really plug, I think we're continuing to talk about the expansion for older adults 65 and over. It took the larger part of a year. I think so much of our seniors had spent their entire life here in Illinois hearing don't apply for healthcare. It could impact your immigration status should you choose to adjust, right? Just a severe mistrust of healthcare institutions. And here we are saying, hey, we finally won this program for you, go and get it. And people were like, nah, I can't trust you yet. So I think we're actively just trying to spread the word about that present expansion. And I mentioned 6,500 seniors that have that program for the first time, that I think we know that there's significantly more folks that could benefit. So I think just as much as folks can help us be a mouthpiece for that program, we would appreciate it. And I think anticipating, right, that next year up to 12,000 Illinoisans could be eligible for the next pathway, it really tells us that we need to partner with as many of you all to really have conversations that really center why this kind of coverage is not only important, but is life-saving on day one. And then I think just knowing that as a coalition, we're going to continue coming back for every adult that doesn't have coverage, regardless of immigration status. So that also involves us continuing to fight for pathways for folks that are documented, the African-American community that isn't enrolling for various reasons, right? What are the ways that we can continue to form really strong coalitions to make sure that we're talking about access well beyond immigration status? So those are a couple of things that are coming up for us as well.
Vanessa, please go ahead.
Real quick, I dropped in the chat a link, and maybe we could share that with folks. It's just it's our DCEO website, illinois.gov/DCEO. It's our Back to Business grant. So this is for the smallest of the small, the hardest hit businesses from the pandemic that have been disproportionately impacted, especially again Black and Brown business owners. We're doing a ton of outreach to engage folks. Similar to the census, we're not seeing as much response from Latinx business owners, and we know this is long-standing issues around trust, very valid issues, right, that we need to work on long-term. But we are trying to encourage as many Latinx business owners to apply. All business owners, right, are eligible, but dropping that in the chat. We're doing a ton of canvassing. We've probably been out in your community at some point or another to just share more information. And thank you, Commissioner. And I know that you just participated in an event yesterday. So we're doing as much outreach as possible. We really want to just make sure that we're encouraging folks to apply. We know these are family-run businesses and the lifeblood of our communities, and so we want to make sure that they take advantage of this resource.
And on my end, I'm working on behavioral health, right? I think that's the pandemic has really highlighted that. So I, along with two of my colleagues, Brandon Johnson and Dennis Deere, are going to be saying that behavioral health is now a crisis here in Cook County, and we need to put all of our resources. So we've been working very diligently, as you all may know, with the president's office and other areas to ensure that behavioral health is a priority with the funding of ARPA coming in. So we need all the support that we can. We passed a resolution a few months back to get a behavioral health report from all the differently independently electeds to see what type of investment has been made, but also what other things we need to do to ensure that communities of color have the resources necessary. The other area is in housing. We know when I first ran, when they asked me, what's a top priority, I always said housing. And, people laughed at me. They were like, no, that's not something at the county. But in the reality, we've seen that it has been something that's been impacting our people. We are the entity that collects property taxes, that does the assessment. So we've been working with the assessor's office and other entities to ensure that people do have, the correct assessments, but they're also not being displaced. So we're working on that. And finally, we're working on accessibility. Cook County, because of our buildings are a little older, we've been working to ensure that it becomes accessible, whether it's through language access or whether it's through our actual physical spaces to do that. So I'll continue to advocate for that, and we're working on that. So stay tuned, and we'll definitely plug you all in if, with any hearings or anything else coming up on our end.
Thank you, Commissioner. We are past time, but I really, really want to thank our panelists for an amazing discussion, very inspirational. I want to thank the audience for tuning in today. I encourage everyone to continue staying engaged with Cook County's Racial Equity Week. There's plenty of events happening this week. And again, thank you for joining us, and I wish everyone a great rest of your week. Gracias.